Hi, my name is Laura, and welcome to my podcast, Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations, and through these discussions, you will hear why 9 times out of 10, the book wins. I'll also share different behind-the-scenes trivia I've discovered in my research, which by learning makes the story all the more interesting. If you love either books, movies, or both, this is the perfect podcast for you. This probably already goes without saying, but there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie in this podcast. So if you plan on reading the book or watching the movie, go do that first, and then come back and listen to this. And now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am talking about Crazy Rich Asians, which is a book released in 2013, written by Kevin Kwan. They made a movie of it, directed by John M. Chu, which was released in 2018 under the same name. So this movie came out more recently, obviously, and it did really well at the box office. So, plus this book was like a New York Times bestseller. So I'm sure a lot of people already know the storyline. However, I'm going to give a synopsis nonetheless. And the book and the movie do have a number of differences. So the synopsis will cover what happens in the book. And then we'll get into the movie differences afterwards. So Nick invites his girlfriend of 2 years to join him in his home country of Singapore for the summer. She's never met his family before, aside from one cousin. And their summer trip will start with the wedding of his best friend. And at his wedding, during the week of his wedding, she'll be meeting all of his friends and family for the first time. And turns out Nick comes from an insanely wealthy family. However, they are extremely private, and only the ultra elite even know who they are. Because Nick was raised not to talk about his family or their money, he just never bothers giving Rachel a heads up about how rich they are. He also comes from a society where who you marry is a family matter, and it needs to be someone from the proper social background. His mom, Eleanor, as well as all the other women, young and old, are obsessed with finding out as much about Rachel as possible, and they try to prevent Nick from wanting to marry her. So Rachel is tossed into this life, and she has to endure rude comments and backhanded compliments, and she's also just in shock from the sheer wealth of these people. She can't believe Nick just threw her into this, and after several humiliating experiences, tells him that she is leaving. He tells her not to go and that he'll drive her somewhere private, where it can be just the two of them. And once they arrive at this private location, which I should mention, this private location is his grandma's summer home. And he tells his mom that he's going there. Before they leave, he tells her that they're going to the grandma's summer home and that he's going to propose to Rachel, and, he doesn't care what she thinks. So they arrive here, and once they get there, they see that his mom and his grandma are sitting outside. They tell him that he cannot marry Rachel and that it's for her own good, and they say that she comes from a bad family and proceeds to provide evidence that her dad is in prison. And she had told them that her dad was dead because she was raised by her mom being told that her dad died when she was a baby. So she is shocked to realize this information. So they leave, and she goes to stay with her friend Picklin. And she tells Nick that they're over, and after getting upset at her mom on the phone for having lied to her, she decides to go to China, and she's going to see her dad, who is in prison. Nick decides to do whatever it takes to get Rachel back, and he ends up flying to California to bring Rachel's mom to Singapore. And before Rachel can leave for the plane to China, Nick and her mom show up, and the mom explains everything that happened, when Rachel was a baby, and how the guy in prison actually isn't her dad. In the end, ultimately, everyone is happy, and Nick cuts off his family in order to be with Rachel. And then the book and the movie have this side story with Nick's cousin Astrid. So she and her husband Michael have been married for almost 5 years, and they have one son. Michael does not come from the insanely rich families, and even though he has a good job, it's his own company, he's making decent money, it's just nothing compared to her personal wealth or her family's money. And early on in the story, she finds out that her husband is cheating on her. And so she confronts him, and he says he's going to move out. And she's like, no, I don't want you to move out. We can work through this. But he persists in being like, no, I'm just going to move out. And then she later confronts him at what she assumes is his mistress's apartment. And turns out he was faking the whole affair. And he was pretending to have an affair so that getting a divorce would be so that she would want to get a divorce, basically. And the reason he wants a divorce isn't because he doesn't love her or, his son. It's because he just can't stand being part of her family. She tries to convince him to stay and that she would, cut her family off for him. But he's like, no, I can't make you do that. They're such a huge part of your life. And in the end, she still loves him and wants him back, but she's giving him the space he wants. Earlier on, she had run into her ex-fiance, Charlie, and he's the one who helps her track Michael down and find this apartment he was staying at. And after having this conversation with Michael, she goes back to see Charlie. He convinces her to not grant the divorce for a year, just wait. And he thinks Michael will eventually come around and decide he, does want to still be with her. And so the storyline is left open with us not knowing what really happens in their marriage. However, it's definitely setting Charlie up to be the more likable one, basically. So I'm sure in the sequel, she is going to end up being with Charlie. So my thoughts on the book: some of the characters are definitely a bit cliche, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to be using the word cliche a few times throughout this podcast. So some of the characters are cliche, however, they are much more fleshed out than they had been in the movie. And it was written by a man, but it was obviously targeted to a female audience. And so there's just a ton of rom-com cliches throughout this whole book and movie. Even the story of Rachel's mom. So she was abused by her husband. Rachel's dad is this guy who helps rescue her from this bad relationship, and they fall in love. And even that, I just don't like when stories of trauma are told in this romantic, lifetimey way, rather than the harsh reality that it really was. And Lifetime, by the way, if you don't know, was a TV channel. It probably still is, but I don't have cable, so I don't watch it. But it would show chick flicks, but not necessarily romantic comedies. It would show the chick flicks more like this, about stories about a woman who's being abused by her husband, and then, this guy rescues her and they fall in love and all that sort of stuff. These exciting events. That's why I don't like it, is because they romanticize it as if being in that situation would be so romantic and exciting, when really that would be horrible. So I feel like it's very unhealthy for books and movies to portray things like that as if it's something exciting and romantic. Anyway, so the acting, we have Constance Wu, who plays Rachel, and you will recognize her from Fresh Off the Boat, the TV show, if you've watched that. And overall, I think she's a good actress. There's nothing amazing about her performance, but, no complaints. Henry Golding is Nick Young, and this was his first ever acting role. Prior to this, he had been a travel host on a BBC show, and he was offered the role, but he turned it down multiple times, being like, I'm sure you guys can find an actual actor to play this role. But they kept offering it to him, and eventually he said yes. And he does a great job. Yeah, it's impressive since it was his first one, and since then he's been in a handful of other movies, so his acting career has definitely taken off. For Eleanor, we have Michelle Yeoh, and she gives a great performance. After watching this, I actually went and watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which she is in, and that is such a great movie. She is actually a very impressive martial artist, and she's been in a number of Jackie Chan movies back, when Jackie Chan, now I feel like a lot of people just associate him with comedies, but Jackie Chan is a great martial artist, and she was in a lot of movies with him, and she was the only female actress he ever had do her own stunts. And the fight scenes in Crouching Tiger are also good. I don't even usually like fight scenes, but ones like this, they're just almost like a dance or something. It's so well done, and it's such a good movie. Great storyline, great acting. And I know this episode is focused on Crazy Rich Asians, but I just want to say that if you haven't watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or if it's just been a while because it came out 20 years ago, so if you haven't seen it recently, I highly suggest you go back and rewatch it. But yeah, she does a great job playing the protective mother in Crazy Rich Asians. We have Gemma Chan, who plays Astrid. Her acting is fine. Her character, my main complaint with her character is with the writing, because they just made her character too cliche, and they left out a lot that had been in the book. And she also, it looks like she got plastic surgery before this movie or something, because her face has a weird look, like her lips and stuff. But, she's still pretty, and she does a good job. Aquafina plays Picklin, and she has risen to stardom in recent years thanks to YouTube. And she's been in a number of major films, and she's even won a Golden Globe. And in this, she is well cast as, Rachel's quirky friend. The premise for both the book and the movie are the same, but there are actually a number of changes, some of which are pretty big. So I'm going to start out talking about the differences with the Nick and Rachel storyline, and then I'll talk about the differences with the Astrid storyline. So first off, Rachel is a card player, and she teaches her poker playing techniques in her class that she teaches, because she teaches a college class. And in both, she's a college teacher and is an economics major, but in the book, she never does anything in regards to poker or anything like that. And in the book, they've been dating for just over 2 years, where in the movie, they switched it to 1 year. And I'm guessing they did that because if you're dating someone for 2 years and you know basically nothing about their family and have never met them, that I feel like would be a red flag and kind of weird. So I'm assuming they changed it to 1 year because that's a bit more realistic. Also, the trip he invites her on in the book is over the summer, and it's a 10-week trip, whereas in the movie it's just for spring break, so just 1 week. In both the book and the movie, word of Nick and Rachel dating spreads fast because a girl in the coffee shop recognizes him and she takes a picture, and that picture gets texted all around. And in the movie, word spreads so fast that his mom calls him while he's there still talking about it with Rachel. Whereas in the book, Eleanor never calls Nick. After talking to Rachel at some point, he calls his mom and tells her that he's bringing Rachel, and the mom just acts, nonchalant. But of course, behind the scenes, she's trying to learn as much as she can about this girl. And she even calls Astrid because Astrid has met Rachel, and she is, fishing for information in a very sly way. And things in the movie move much faster than they did in the book, which is to be expected. In the book, they aren't even on their way to Singapore until like 100 pages in. Throughout the book, it switches between the different perspectives. So early on, you're just learning all these different characters and what they're like and what their lives are like. Which, by the way, there are a lot of characters in this book. At the beginning, there's a page that has a chart of the family tree, just so you can keep everyone in line. But even so, I lost track of who was who. And when they arrive in Singapore, in both book and movie, Arminta and Colin surprise them at the airport and take them out to eat. The actress who plays Arminta is Sonia Mazzino, who is amazing. She's so versatile, and she just becomes whoever she's playing. And she's been in movies where she plays someone very serious, and then movies like this where she's kind of loud and boisterous. And also she was in La La Land, where she was singing and dancing. She's just very underrated, and I would love to see her in more leading roles. And she was a great choice for Arminta. Arminta is a supermodel, and Mizuno definitely has that look. And I feel like even though it was a smaller role, it was probably an exciting one to play, partly because she got to get all dressed up for the wedding scene. When Rachel goes to Picklin's house, we meet her family, and her dad is played by none other than Ken Jeong, who everyone will recognize, I would think. He's the famous comedian who used to be a doctor before deciding to pursue his dreams of comedy and improv. He's been in one episode of The Office, he was in Community, not to mention the Hangover movies, and so much more. In the book, Rachel mentions that she is going to the wedding of Colin Koo, and when she says that, everyone stops eating and is like, "Are you serious? Like, who is your boyfriend?" And when she tells them his name, they don't even know who he is, because the Youngs are so private that, your average person, which Picklin and her family are rich, but not quite at the level of the Youngs, obviously, and so they don't even know who they are. But Picklin's dad has connections, and he talks to this one guy, and he's able to find out who the Youngs are. In the movie, they know the Youngs. The Youngs aren't as private. So when she says her boyfriend is Nick Young, that's when they all stop eating and are like, "What? You're dating Nick Young?" So they totally got rid of the part where their family's private. And when Picklin drops Rachel off at Ama's house, which Ama is what they call grandma, when she drops her off at her house for their flower blooming party, in the movie, Nick invites her to join them. However, in the book, this was a very exclusive event, and Picklin is hoping to be invited, but she isn't. He also doesn't even tell Rachel about the event until like an hour beforehand. So throughout this whole thing, especially in the book, he's just, bringing these things on her just at the very last minute. So he definitely isn't very considerate. And while at this event in the movie, Rachel meets Eleanor. However, in the book, Eleanor specifically goes out of town the weekend Nick and Rachel arrive. And so it's her way of, a power move to show that she's not even going to be in town to meet Rachel right away. Rachel also talks to Amma while at this event. However, in the book, they only talk very briefly. Like, it's hard, like not really at all, hardly. And Nick later goes up to her and asks if she wants to talk to Rachel. And Amma says, no, there's too many people looking around. So why don't you guys just come over tomorrow and you can stay here the rest of your stay and I can get to know her privately. Whereas in the book, they actually talk at the flower blooming party. And at this party, we meet Oliver, who is played by Nick Santos, who you may recognize if you watch the show Superstore. And then we have this whole bachelorette and bachelor parties. Starting with the bachelorette party, Rachel meets a girl named Amanda, who she befriends. Amanda later shows, though, that she isn't her friend at all and is ultimately with the group who is trying to scare Rachel off. In the book, Amanda doesn't even show up, though, until the wedding. And at the bachelorette party, it was this girl named Francesca, and she's the main one trying to get to Rachel. Later in the evening, a girl named Sophie shows up late, and Rachel and Sophie become friends in the book. And Sophie, is being a genuine friend, and she never turns on Rachel the way Amanda does. Whereas in the movie, the Sophie character is just totally removed. In the book, when she finds the gutted fish in her room, she goes to Sophie's room and tells her about it, and she says that she wants to call security. And Sophie talks her out of it, being like, no, you'd be playing into their hands. That's what they want you to do. Whereas in the movie, so instead of meeting Sophie, she meets Astrid, or she sees Astrid again because Astrid shows up late. So she and Astrid are the ones who are talking. And when they see the gutted fish, Astrid says they should call security, but Rachel is the one that's like, no, that'd be playing into their hands. And then with the bachelor party, in both the book and the movie, the character Bernard is in charge of hosting it. And in the movie, he says, dogfighting, hookers, drugs, that's all rookie bachelor party stuff. And proceeds to fly them to this giant cruise type ship where he has this crazy party going on. But all that stuff he mentions, dogfighting, hookers, and drugs, that's all the stuff that they do in the book, actually. So it's kind of funny how he mentions it like that in the movie. And of course, this is a chick flick, so Nick and Colin are the likable guys who weren't interested, in any of that. And in the book, they end up on a ship ultimately as well. And Nick, Colin, and this other guy who's not even in the movie, they end up getting a helicopter out and they fly to Australia where they watch the desert sunset while drinking a flat white. And in the movie, he and Colin also leave the party and they go off and do their own thing. And while they're sitting together, Colin tries to convince Nick that he, shouldn't be dating Rachel and that ultimately it can't go anywhere. And this never happened in the book because throughout the book, Colin is always supportive and thinks that he should be with Rachel if he loves her. Also, with the bachelor party in the movie, Eddie is there. But in the book, Eddie isn't invited, and he is very upset about this, of course. And his character is a bigger role in the book, and he's one of the ones whose first-hand perspective you get. And they make him dislikable in the movie, but in the book, he's even more dislikable. So when they get back, Rachel tells Nick all of this, and he comforts her in the movie. In the book, she keeps it all to herself, and she doesn't tell him anything. And then later in that day, they go to Eleanor's house to have a personal dinner with just Nick, Rachel, Eleanor, and Eleanor's husband. But turns out Eleanor invited other people because she wanted more people in her corner to help interrogate Rachel. And in the book, there is some drama between Eleanor and Rachel, obviously. But in the movie, they definitely played it up more. They have the scene where they're standing on the stairs and Eleanor tells Rachel that she'll never be enough. And then the whole thing about how American it is to pursue your passions. And obviously the very end scene with the mahjong. And none of these interactions took place in the book. So obviously Eleanor doesn't want Nick getting with Rachel, but she doesn't have all these tense interactions. The movie also has drama between Amma and Eleanor, but that also isn't said in the book. There is also a line in the book where Amma is alone with Rachel and she tells her how she knows what kind of a person someone is based on their face. And then she tells Rachel, I see your face. And Rachel doesn't know what to make of it. And then Nick walks in, so nothing else is ever said. And this scene is not in the movie. The closest they get to it is a scene where Amma is looking at Rachel's face and tells her she has a nice nose. Also in the movie, they go and make dumplings. This did not happen in the book. But while they're making dumplings, Rachel says how great it is because she doesn't have a big family. It's just her and her mom. And this was not the case. In the book, she talks about having, uncles and aunts and cousins and how much she loves hanging out with them. And one of her uncles was the whole reason her mom was able to come to America because she was able to stay with him in the beginning. Also, the day of the wedding, Rachel does sit with Nick's family in the book. In the movie, they made it more dramatic, and there's this princess who wants to be left alone, but Rachel is able to, strike up a conversation, and everybody is so impressed and surprised that she's able to, be sitting with this princess. And then afterwards, in the book, they go to this tea party thing, because in the book, the wedding had 3 different parts. They had the wedding ceremony, followed by this tea party, and then later the reception. So while they're at this tea party thing, Nick takes Rachel to this little alcove area, and he tells her that this is where he had his first kiss. And it's almost a romantic moment. However, Amanda shows up, whom we are meeting for the first time, and she's like, "Oh, fancy meeting you here, Nick. I was just going to show so-and-so where I got my first kiss," because she has a date with her. And then she proceeds to get all flirty with Nick and, about how they were teenage lovers. And then later in the evening, Amanda continues to make these kind of remarks to make Rachel jealous, followed by Francesca, who's also, like I said, throughout the whole story, Francesca is the main one who's been trying to get to Rachel. And she talks about how she, Amanda, and Nick had a threesome, and Rachel just feels so humiliated. And she goes back to where they're staying, and she starts packing her bags. Nick finds her and asks what's wrong. She just tells him about everything, because up until this point, she hadn't told him anything. So she tells him all the things she's been dealing with, and Nick is able to comfort her. And then this is when he takes her to Alma's summer house later. And then, all the drama I talked about that plays out there. Then after all that drama, when she's staying at Pick Lynn's house, she does meet up with Nick, and he tries to convince her that they don't need to break up. And she tells him, "I never want to be part of a family like yours. I can't marry into a clan that thinks it's too good to have me. And I don't want my children to ever be connected to such people. I want them to grow up in a loving, nurturing home surrounded by grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins who consider them equals. Because that's ultimately what I have, Nick. You've seen it yourself when you came home with me last Thanksgiving. You see what it's like with my cousins. We're competitive, we tease each other mercilessly, but at the end of the day, we support each other. That's what I want for my kids. I want them to love their family, but to feel a deeper sense of pride in who they are as individuals. Not in how much money they have, what their last name is, or how many generations they go back to whatever dynasty. I'm sorry, but I've had enough. I've had enough of being around these crazy rich Asians, all these people whose lives revolve around making money, spending money, flaunting money, comparing money, hiding money, controlling others with money, and ruining their lives over money. And if I marry you, there will be no escaping it, even if we live on the other side of the world." So Nick sees where she's coming from, and he decides that, it's just over. But then Colin comes back early from his honeymoon, and he convinces Nick that he should do whatever it takes to get Rachel back. And then, as I said in the synopsis, he flies to get her mom and stops talking to his mom to show his devotion to Rachel, and they end up getting together in the end. In the movie, they're having a good time at the reception, and then Eleanor asks to see Nick and Rachel, and she is with Amma, and they tell Nick that he can't be with her. She then tells her that her dad was a man her mom was having an affair with. So the whole thing was kind of changed, because in the book, they don't know that her mom was having an affair. They think that her dad was the guy in prison. So they sort of changed that. But anyway, Rachel is so blindsided, and she rushes to leave the reception, and she goes to stay at Pick Lynn's house. While there, she is depressed, but then her mom shows up, and she's happy to see her mom. And the mom tells her, explains to her why she had lied. The mom's backstory is a little different, but overall the same. They just left a few, like in the book, it's more detailed. Anyway, her mom then tells her that Nick is the one who brought her here, and that Rachel really should go see him. So they meet up, and Nick proposes, but the scene cuts out before we can know what she says. And then it switched to the scene where Rachel is meeting Eleanor at this place where people are playing mahjong. And while there, she tells Eleanor that Nick proposed, and that he said he was willing to cut his family out for her. But she told him no, because she wouldn't make him do that. And then she says the whole thing about, so years from now, when you're playing with your grandkids and Nick is married to a woman you approve of, you can think of me, and it's all thanks to me that you'll have that. And then later after that, we see Eleanor with Nick, basically giving him permission to marry Rachel, and she now respects her and approves of her. And Rachel is on a plane to go back to America when Nick gets on, and he proposes to her, which, come on, hasn't the whole airport plane romantic propose thing been way overdone at this point? So yeah, that is come on, do something different. But anyway, he proposes, she says yes, And then they leave the plane and they go to this huge party in Singapore where everybody's at, and happy ending. So a fairly different ending than in the book, because the book, we never see Eleanor approving of Rachel, and in the book, he does cut his mom off in order to be with her. And so now on to the differences with the Astrid storyline. So for starters, he doesn't go to any of the events for the wedding. Before all that stuff even happens, though, there is a family dinner, and we see how Astrid's dad doesn't like Michael, and her family all treats him as someone who can just solve their broken computers and stuff, so they just don't have any respect for him. In the book, she does go shopping a lot. However, she doesn't hide her stuff around the house like she does in the movie. She has a spare room, and she just puts all of it in there. And she does lie to him about the price of things, but she's not like sneaking it around the house like she does in the book. Like she does in the movie. And then in the book, she sees the text, making it seem like he's having an affair. And for the next month or so, she's kind of on the lookout for more evidence, which she finds. And then while driving home from that flower blooming party, she gets into a car accident because she's busy being distracted thinking about Michael. And so she's in the hospital for a couple days. And when they get home, she confronts Michael, and that's when he says he'll move out. And the movie doesn't have the car accident scene. Instead, she confronts him while they're in the car on the way to the wedding. And then they get in an argument, and the car stops and he gets out. At this point in the book, the day of the wedding, Michael had already moved out. So there wasn't, a dramatic scene like that. Also, the movie shows her confiding in Rachel about Michael's affair, whereas in the book, she keeps everything to herself and never confides in anybody. And in general, they just made Michael more dislikable in the movie, and he doesn't seem to care about their son, which wasn't the case at all in the book. Also, in the movie, apparently he really was having an affair. There's never a scene that leads us to believe otherwise. In the end, he says how he's going to move out, and Astrid is like, this is your apartment, you can stay. And he's like, well, where are you going to go? And she's like, I have hundreds of my own apartments and houses I can choose from. Like in the movie, apparently he didn't realize this. But in the book, he knows. Like, she lies about the cost of her clothing, but he's not that dumb, and he knows that they're more expensive than she's saying. He also knows that she owns a ton of properties. And the reason he knows this is because before they even got married, her brothers invited him to dinner, and then they kind of ambushed him, showing them all these papers about Astrid's net worth and all the property she owns, and just trying to scare him off and intimidate him. Which, that, plus thinking of the quote Rachel said, can't really blame Michael for wanting out of this controlling family who's obsessed with your status. So Michael is more likable in the book overall. And then, as I said, in the book, she meets her ex-fiance Charlie while she's at the wedding. And while they're at the wedding, Charlie is very rich, and he gets a private plane to fly them to Hong Kong where Michael is. And he uses his tech abilities and spies and whatever to find out where Michael is staying. And they find the apartment, and that's when she goes and confronts him. And later when she's talking to Charlie, he kind of points out the things that she was doing wrong in the relationship. Like, she wasn't being her true self. She was lying and keeping secrets, trying to be who she thought Michael wanted her to be. Like I said, in the end, it isn't clear what's going to happen between her and Michael, but I'm assuming she'll be with Charlie. Also, in the credits, Harry Shum Jr. is credited as playing Charlie, but he doesn't have any scenes really. And Harry Shum Jr., by the way, was in Glee, so if you were a Gleek, you'll recognize him. Apparently there's a scene where he's at a bar and he smiles at Astrid, but I didn't catch the scene. And I feel like they must have filmed scenes with him actually having lines, but I guess they got deleted, because I don't know why else he would be in the credits. But the fact that he is there and he is credited confirms my opinion that he is going to be the one that ends up getting with Astrid, which there is a book sequel. This book story has 3 books. They are going to be making a movie sequel. However, it won't come out until like 2022. I'm probably just going to wait to read the book until it's closer to the movie coming out. So those are the big differences. The book has way more details than the movie does. So I didn't get into everything, but the major differences are the ones I mentioned. And so between the book or the movie is definitely entertaining, and I love that it was an all-Asian cast, and the book has a lot of characters, and the movie tried to bring as many as they could into the movie, but by trying to include all these different people, all these characters ended up being kind of one-sided. And I wish they would have stuck to the original story in regards to Astrid, But other than that, with the Rachel and Nick stuff, I didn't mind the changes they made. Even changing the ending so that Eleanor approves of Rachel, that didn't bother me. It was a bit cliche, but, Another thing with the book, though, is that there were like 2 or 3 times when some kind of sexual act is mentioned in a somewhat explicit way. And it's nothing too graphic, but it was still enough that it caught me by surprise, because the movie, which I had seen before I watched it in 2018, the movie is PG-13 and is pretty clean. So I was surprised that the book had some scenes like that. So just a heads up if you decide to read the book. But overall, though, I say the book does win in this case. You just get to know the characters more. They're more fleshed out. And even though there are, all these typical chick flick elements, the book, it is a bit less cliche than the movie. But yeah, I guess that wraps it up on Crazy Rich Asians. Let me know your thoughts. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the movie. Don't forget to tune in next week, which will be October already, which is crazy. But I have some books picked out that are fitting for the month of October, sort of Halloween-y. I won't be reading any like horror books, so sorry if you like, horror movies and scary books and stuff. Sorry to let you down, but I do have books that are fitting for the month of October. So make sure you stay tuned, and thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, head over to my site, whythebookwins.com. You can leave a comment there and I will be sure to reply. You can also find me on Instagram under the same name, Why the Book Wins, and you can message me there, and don't forget to follow. And also don't forget to subscribe to my podcast and join me next Wednesday for the newest episode of Why the Book Wins.